And with that, I welcome very warm-heartedly our guests on stage, Jami, MISCIK, Anna Rosenberg, John STUDZINSKI. John, Jami, Anna. Busy days, busy times, so thanks for making the time and for joining our panel here for the next 50, 60 minutes. I'd like to start with a quick introduction before we go into, of course, the round of questions. Jami, I'd like to start with you. You're the CEO of Global Strategic Insights, and you're a senior advisor within Lazard's Geopolitical Advisory Group. And before that, before joining the private sector, you have been serving at the Central Intelligence Agency. Thank you. Anna Rosenberg is with us. Anna, you're the head of geopolitics at Amundi Asset Management. You are an analyst keeping an eye on global geopolitical risk hotspots, so quite a busy job right now. And you examine which political risks are approaching Europe, what impacts they may have on financial markets, and of course, how investors can get prepared and can fuel that muscle of resilience with that. So again, Anna, thank you for making the time, for being here.
Pleasure.
Last but not least, we have John with us. John STUDZINSKI, you're the Vice Chairman and Managing Director of the global investment firm PIMCO. So again, thank you to you as well for making the time. I mentioned already very bold questions, difficult questions that are not easy to answer. How can Europe lead the energy transition forward? What incentives are needed from a technological perspective when it comes to a sustainable future? And how can we balance climate goals with economic competitiveness? And before we dive into a conversation, I'd like to do a quick round à table, as we say. So Jami, from your perspective when it comes to European economic strength, a view from the US, how do you see the to-do list, so to say?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here again. Did one of these a couple of years ago, and it's nice to be back. I think, when the United States and US investors look at Europe, they see a lot of strength. They see innovative companies, they see great educational systems, they see real human talent. I think where you start to see some of the difficulties is, depending on the sector, of course, how scalable is it? Are you able to reach, broadly across Europe? And I think some of those issues are what goes through their mind. Obviously, investing long term, requires stability, certainty, less volatility. And I think, with some of the elections underway, that has been, one of the focus points for investors as well. Obviously, that was the same in the US up until November, when people were looking at investing in the US. So it's not a one-way street in that regard.
John, turning to you with the European perspective and from the perspective as a global investor, how do we build up the strength, the muscle of resilience when it comes to investments and making investments in the economic sphere?
Well, I think you first of all have to think about rules of engagement. Point one, investors think short term, who think about liquidity and think about short-term return. Secondly, they think about secular trends and long-term returns. And by the word secular, I might want to say 5 years. So you've really got to distinguish short-term opportunities, whether it's in fixed income, alternatives, or equities. And right now, of course, you've got a very interesting global macro situation. You've got a very robust US economy, strong labor market, inflation remains resilient. You've got a very fragile Chinese economy, and you've got a European economy that is very much depending on which country you focus on. You want to focus on Spain, very strong economy. You want to focus on Poland, very strong economy. You want to focus on Germany, France, big economies, weak economies. So, and there's also this concern about how do you factor geopolitical risk and uncertainty into investment decisions. And that's a new element. That's something that people are not generally used to. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I would say is, since COVID, everyone has learned a new game or a new lesson or a new set of rules, which is how do we respond to shocks? And of course, the most recent shock the world is having to cope with is the US presidential administration. What is that shock, and how does that affect the investment climate, particularly as we're looking at this whole duality of talent versus capital, and whether capital chases talent and innovation, or whether innovation and talent chase capital.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. We dive into that in a second or third round. Thank you, John, for your introduction. Anna, talking a lot about geopolitical risks and how, from your perspective and from your big to-do list, of course, on your desk, where do you see the to-dos for economic security in Europe, in the European Union, and to face all these geopolitical hotspots that we are currently dealing with, especially also today when we read the news?
Yes, I think Europe has two pretty existential issues. First is the trade war with the US, and secondly, clearly, the Russia-Ukraine war. Both of these have huge economic implications. When we're looking at what does the US actually want from Europe, let's talk about trade first. Here, the goals are manifold. Firstly, they want to achieve trade balance, right? That's the first one. But what the US also wants is to attract European firms to invest into the US. They see Europe under the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration, as strategic competitors. When we remember the Inflation Reduction Act, there was an effort to bring European firms to invest in the US. Now, Trump's going to want more of that, okay? So we're going to see tariffs, and there will be economic pain. There will be a retaliation to those tariffs, and that will likely bring more economic pain. We'll likely have some deals as well, but nevertheless, I think this is a significant headwind that Europe will face, which will cost money, which will be hard for the economy. And then secondly, you have the most likely outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war, which will be a ceasefire in which Europe is going to be expected to spend quite a lot more money on defense, on security, to protect itself over the next several years. So what all of this means is that we have significant, huge geopolitical challenges that have significant economic implications. Now, we all know, as Europeans, that Europe acts when it's between a rock and a hard place. So the suggestions in the Draghi report, the money, the amount of money we're talking about
800 billion.
Exactly, is laughable for many European governments in many contexts. However, it is not laughable when Europe is between a rock and a hard place. So we may come to that point where that money is really going to be able to be found in some shape or form, but we're not there yet.
When we talk about the Draghi report, and you mentioned it, it doesn't sound that Europe is really prepared to spend all this money and to tackle all the geopolitical obstacles right now, right?
Not yet, because the individual member states, the political priorities are local, first and foremost. If you look at, we have elections coming up in Germany right now. Most parties are acutely aware that there's a need to reform the so-called debt brake in order to be able to spend a lot more on defense, on infrastructure. But right now, it's a political non-starter. You cannot talk about this seriously as the main party in question ahead of the election, even though it will likely happen after the election. So we have domestic politics that prevents big ambition on the EU level. Once the elections are out of the way, the big ambition becomes a little bit more realistic.
And thank you, Jami. I'd like to turn again to the US topic, not to dive into the policy details here, but just because we are circulating around, of course, of different policies made in the US. The Biden administration, with the Biden administration, the US has passed 3 major pieces of legislation, just to name the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and what you just mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act, Anna, and the Chips and Science Act. So from all these acts, and with our big topic here of collaborating, of working together, maybe also from learning from each other, where would you see with these details, how did these policies, especially, how did they interact together, and in your opinion, how have they been successful in the way that Europe can learn from them?
It's a good question, and there's a lot in that. You know, I think if you go back to 70s, 80s, industrial policy was not something that was done in the United States. It was done in Europe. And the U.S. economists often looked at it and said, this is not a good idea. Now, with the kinds of acts that you're talking about, with the kind of reshoring efforts underway in the U.S., there is at least an informal embrace of industrial policies now. We'll have to see how they work out. Obviously, the new administration is trying to roll back some of the things around electric vehicles, clean energy, and the like. Some of the money that was allocated hasn't actually been delivered yet, so again, that'll be something to watch. But I do think the lessons learned, and John started to allude to this, coming out of COVID, it was clear that we were overly dependent and that we had hollowed out too much of an industrial base or a manufacturing sector. It started with PPE, the personal protective equipment that we couldn't get enough of during COVID. It then moved to supply chains. When companies thought that they had the right to export products out of China and that they were being stopped, that caused a lot of corporations to look for not alternatives to China, but redundancies, to be more resilient in terms of their supply chains. I think those types of lessons are applicable absolutely to the European situation. I do think, though, that some companies, and I sit on several corporate boards in the US, have been surprised because as they moved away from exclusive or overly reliant position in China, they moved to countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Thailand, and now those countries are being hit with tariffs that were unexpected, or at least in calibration to what they expected vis-a-vis China. So I think there are lessons still being learned in the U.S. from all of this.
When we look into the capital market, John, you mentioned earlier capital follows talent. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? What do you mean by that? And when you say human capital, do we have enough human capital in Europe to build up the economic strength? Or is that also a high priority that we should all be aware of when it comes to building up the resilience?
This is a big topic. Europe, ironically, Europe is impeccably good at innovation. They're not good at monetizing innovation. If you look at Europe, and I still regard the UK as part of Europe. I know that may not be politically acceptable for this conversation, but if you look at the strength of the universities in terms of Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, if you look at the universities in Switzerland, Germany, if you look at the magnitude of the quality of R&D, and it's particularly the R, Europe competes bang on with North America, Northern California, Boston, and the southeastern part of Emerald Bay of China. It's the area of patent issuance and access to capital where Europe doesn't have enough of a unified strategy. It has to begin to see itself more as a tech hub, aggregating the expertise on the research side. Quantum mechanics is a good example. Quantum mechanics in Europe, very strong in terms of the research. You have to ensure, A, you keep the talent in Europe, and you have a hub that attracts capital with public-private partnerships with either corporations and or governments. If you do that, you will be able to be competitive. And you know, it's timely given the shock I refer to right now, because you've got artificial intelligence, which is on a steep change, and we're in inning 1 of a 9-inning baseball game on AI. It's going to have a big impact on how higher education is done and the business model of higher education, and how talent is trained and managed, and how talent enters the workforce. So you've got, this is a time with this, what I call shock, of dealing with the strength of China in innovation and North America on innovation. Europe still has the fundamentals, but what it lacks is a leadership model to bring this together in terms of one hub or one focus. It's still very
sleepy, as it sounds.
Well, I don't know. Sleepy is not a good word. I think it's fragmented.
Yeah.
One is very clear. In North America, you've got Northern California and increasingly Boston. In China, there's a strong hub of innovation in the Emerald Bay region. Lots of innovation. And let's remember, China is so successful because the model of that economy since 1949 has been on a 5-year plan, where you've had the industrial complex, increasingly the technology complex, and the government looking at a 5-year plan in terms of goals and objectives, which included science, innovation, technology, capital allocation. America has, you've made the wonderful point that America has just figured this out in the last sort of 10 years. But prior to that, it had Northern California and the innovations coming out of Stanford, Caltech, Palo Alto, and all the innovation there that has been, all that capital that continues to recycle, which is, you know, many Chinese have said to me about Northern California, how did that happen? And I said, well, it's been going on for about 100 years. And it's been very much an independent of the US government. And now you see them joining up. Europe needs to decide how it wants to handle innovation. It has the grassroots talent. It just needs to decide how it wants to, what framework it wants to make sure that talent is nurtured and invested in.
Thank you, John. And I'd like to come back to you to hear your perspective, because what John just mentioned, and it was also underlined in the Draghi report, and when we look into the numbers between 2008 and 2021, close to 30% of the unicorns founded in Europe relocated then the headquarters abroad, and then mainly moving to the United States of America. That's also just to underline your argument with facts and figures. So what's wrong with the European startup ecosystem? Are we, and I call it again, sleepy, fragmented? What's wrong, and where do you see a priority in scaling up this innovation ecosystem to let the startups flourish and to find the capital that is needed?
So in Europe, we have lifelong politicians in charge of big states and big bureaucracies that keep on getting bigger. In the US now, we have a businessman in charge. So it tells you that the priorities are quite different, right? That's a start with. Clearly, this has not always been the case. I completely agree with John that in Europe we have very good research, we have very good minds, we have good talent, we have good universities. The problem is that oftentimes they stay in that ecosystem. They don't go out into the business world, and if they do, they get cheaper access to contracts in the US. Then trying to figure out the grant system of the European Union, which is small, slow, or trying to get in with governments. Our governments have so much political volatility in the last few years. They do not have China's ability to have long-term plans and to actually put them into practice. So what I think is the issue here is that there's a big disconnect between the private sector and the public sector. And the public sector knows this. They are trying to fix this, but they're always fixing it with the same people from lifelong politicians. And the challenge is that there is no incentive to change that, and there's also not enough input and experience to change that. And I think really that is the fundamental challenge. I think when you look at Germany and the public administration, we often have lawyers in the public administration, right? Lawyers by training. This is the case also in the European Union. And the challenge that you have with this is that oftentimes lawyers are trained to be risk averse. That is in direct opposition to entrepreneurs, which take risks. Mm-hmm. And to me, there is a structural disconnect that we need to have more risk takers in the public sector to embrace what is needed from the private sector, from the entrepreneurs, and to give them contract, quick and easy, without major bureaucratic processes. I was yesterday at a panel, and I was really, it's a classic story. There was this company, a German startup in the quantum defense space. A German startup, hugely successful. Do you think they sell to Europe? No, they sell to the US Army. Why? Because it's too complex, too complicated to do it here. Why?
Can I just add on
Absolutely.
this point?
Maybe you have a solution.
No, I think, you know, in the United States, there is, if you look at it as a critical issue, people will say, oh, there's a revolving door in the US. People go in and out of government, they go to business, they come back to government. That can actually be a positive in this case, because you are getting people who come with a different sensibility, different exposures to things like, you know, Silicon Valley. The idea of risk-taking is more inherent if you've been in that world and then come into government. I think what we're seeing now in the US is a real change in terms of, I'll just refer to it as Silicon Valley tech. It's broader than that, but that ecosystem was so self-contained and regenerating. You know, people would fail fast. They would still be seen as, you know, entrepreneurs, not seen as failures. They would get, you know, money for their next project, you know, and that would just kind of be a flywheel that would keep going. Those people didn't really want to be part of government. And in fact, you know, if you think back years ago, Google actually had a group of people who refused to work on a government contract. There has been a massive change in the last, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years, I would say, where the technology world has now come to Washington. I would say it started in the Biden administration, in particular, when they started reaching out to the people who are actually in the industry about what should we be thinking about when we look at artificial intelligence and do an executive order on artificial intelligence. Huge private sector input into that. It wasn't just, you know, older politicians who really didn't understand the subject trying to figure it out and put something on paper. And I think that's been a real advantage.
May
I would,
John, and then Anna. Yes, please.
No, I would, this is just a little vignette. I think the day after the inauguration, I was very interested to look at the global social media commentary, particularly in Asia and China, Japan, and in parts of Europe, on the president's inauguration and him standing there with the inauguration in the Capitol with all the major leaders of the US technology industry. And it was interesting because the foreign industrialists and leaders said, America's really changing because you now have the industrial complex and innovation and the government in lockstep. And this is the first time in history when you look at a presidential inauguration that you have this phenomenon. And we're now watching how it's evolving.
Anna, what was your comment on that? Yeah.
My comment on the AI front was that actually we have been, with DeepSeek, Europe has been handed a pretty significant opportunity. We have the research, we have the minds. Now we know that we don't need lots of cheap energy to actually excel on AI. So this is, but that was a huge problem. You need expensive energy for AI, which Europe has a problem with since Russia-Ukraine. So that's off the table. So now that is an opportunity.
Is it a window of opportunity
I think
for Europe?
It's a very big window of opportunity for Europe that we have to grasp. And but it's here now. You know, there was a huge dismay when shortly after the inauguration, the US announced a huge amount of new investment into the AI front, just after Europe had decided, oh, we're going to be serious about AI. But then DeepSeek came along and put this back on the table. And I think this could be one thing where we could grasp this and innovate with our good minds and universities.
I'd like to come back to your investment perspective and investment strategies in times with the ongoing war in Ukraine, the unstable situation in the Middle East, all the other political turbulences that we are facing right now, the regions around sub-Saharan Africa. So all these geopolitical risks on the map, the hotspots, when we look on our beautiful globe, also having the Gulf of America, or Gulf of Mexico, of course. So there are changes right now, they're going on. But from a quote that from the previous panel was said, Kadri Simpson said, global uncertainty makes global investments very difficult. Would you agree? In these times of turbulences, especially when we looked into the geopolitical sentiment tracker from Amundi, that you are also, of course, covering. And then, John, your perspective as well.
Yes, I have my two colleagues here, our CIO of Germany and Helen, who are doing the investing. They have the difficult job. I advise them. They didn't do the hard work. But basically, I think that, yes, it's difficult. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of diversification. You need to hedge a lot. But as Jami was saying, there are also opportunities. If we think about what happened since COVID and Trump 1.0, we had a lot of winners. We had Mexico, we had Vietnam, we had Indonesia. Now the train's starting again, like they're moving to different places. We're hearing El Salvador, a new investment destination, Guatemala. So new winners are emerging, and as investors, it's important to not just react to the risks, but to react to the emerging trends and to react to emerging opportunities. And for that, you need clearly to distinguish noise from what is actually going to happen. You need to spot trends early and the big picture. You need to be realistic. For example, what's the most likely outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war? Markets are constantly flooded with news. Every day it's a different story. And it's very important to be able to filter through that noise, and then you can make informed investment decisions.
John?
Well, I mean, I think from it depends really whether you're looking at short and long-term investments, equity, or fixed income. But let's be reasonable. We're living in an environment now. We were spoiled between 2008 and 2018 up until COVID, where the world was effectively all quantitative easing, low interest rates, low inflation, strong equity market. Now we're much more back to a semblance of reality, which means you've got to cope with volatility. But just thinking carefully, to your point about opportunity, let's say there is a resolution of the Ukraine. There's a whole series of scenarios, we can't speculate. There will be an enormous economic opportunity and a business opportunity for the European economy, probably very much the German and the Italian economies, with the rebuilding of the Ukraine. There's a big project there. And there's no question the Chinese government is very focused on the opportunities of rebuilding the Ukraine for Chinese business and entrepreneurs. And the German government and the Italian government should be focused on this as a business opportunity as well, in terms of rebuilding an economy.
Before we come to your questions, so thank you very much for your submitted questions. I see them coming in, so please, again, the Slido QR code will be shown behind us. Just a quick question again to Jami, coming in from the US perspective again. What and of course, the U.S. industrial strategy will evolve differently than, now under the Trump administration than compared to the Biden administration. But what does it mean, coming back to our main question, what does this then mean to our economic security implications here in Europe, in the European market, for the European market? What are your thoughts on that? What should Europe be prepared for?
Well, I think it's going to be a very volatile period for the next 18 months. And I say 18 months because right now, President Trump controls both the executive branch and both houses in the legislative branch. So any proposal, any legislation that he would like to get through is going to happen probably quickly, because by the time the midterms roll around in 2 years, the House is likely to flip to the Democrats. At least right now, that's the way it looks, and it will become much more difficult to pass legislation. So I would say anything he can do vis-a-vis an executive order, he'll do it that way because it's quicker and more in his control. But legislation will be in this next 18 months for sure. The one thing I would just go back on, and this is relevant to European investment as well, if you're a corporation and you're going to have a long-term fixed investment in a volatile world, and with all of the geopolitical uncertainty that you were mentioning, I think what I'm seeing companies do is invest in business that they already have underway. Don't starve the business, keep it growing. But greenfield investments, like brand new, is this the moment you take that step or not? That's where we see the hesitation. So I think anytime you've got increased volatility on that greenfield long-term fixed investment, you're going to see a pullback or just a hesitation in moving forward.
Let's come to the questions of the audience. Ready? So one question, the first question, you can also vote up the questions that you like, so please join Slido and give your thumbs up. First question, as European battery firms struggle and China expands, where should Europe collaborate for innovation and where must it compete for independence? Where should Europe collaborate for innovation and where must it compete, stand up for independence? John, Anna, I'm looking towards you. Where do you...
Well,
John, let's start with you.
I talked earlier about quantum.
Yeah.
And I think quantum is an area where Europe still on the research side is very strong. I think we also need to... let's pick a number. Let's say there are 50 or 60 innovative technologies that are evolving globally right now. The majority of these are either being led by China or the United States. Very few of them are being led by Europe. So I think it's going to require a focus on 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 areas that are really strong. And I think also there's a need, electric vehicles is the best example. Everybody knows China has won the electric vehicles battle. So let's move on. China's probably pretty far along on batteries. So let's move on. So let's think carefully about innovation, because this, again, I can't emphasize enough what a steep learning curve and change, the change that you're going to experience technologically in the world is exponential. And so much so, we've got to create the right cultural environment. It's not a question of picking your spots and putting money in A, B, and C. It's creating the right environment, which I think you see that to a certain extent with the innovation-focused personality of Elon Musk. I mean, when you read Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk, you see someone that gets very focused on a certain strategy and innovation, and he marshals it to the point where he gets it far enough along. So we're living that, it's a game-changing environment right now. It's not the same ground rules that we've had in the last 25 post-war era. It's very different.
Anna, looking to China,
Yes.
and of course the economic security that the European Union should build up in that regard.
So I think we need to watch this space, because I don't think that the answer to this question is clear yet. We have to understand how friendly the US will remain. Will the US remain a close European ally? I think there's a question mark here still, right? The assumption is that, yes, it will. It's in its geopolitical interest that this will be the case, but we're not entirely sure. And then the question is, with who do you collaborate? With who do you compete? So, as of today, I think we need to look within Europe. We need to look to the UK, because there's lots of strong minds, and I mean, it's part of Europe, I mean, within the EU and the UK. And then we have to see what's actually going to happen on the geopolitical stage in the next couple of months. If the transatlantic relationship remains strong, then clearly we should continue to collaborate with the US. If it begins to weaken, and if that is significant rupture, then we have to readjust. But
to where? In which direction? Towards China?
Well, it will depend on, I mean, here we'll also have a geopolitical challenge, right? So clearly, I think initially, let's look internally, and then we'll take it from there once we know the direction of travel in the next couple of months.
This is a really important point that she's making, because if you look again at is it governments and alliances that are going to drive commercial collaboration, or is it going to be commercial models, corporate models, research and development models that drive how governments collaborate? So it's a question of what is going to be the primary variable and the secondary variable. And you see this right now with some of the debates on China, Tesla, and Elon Musk. And so it's early days, and we have to see these two big variables: corporate technology, innovation versus governments. And how is one going to drive the other, or the other one be dependent on the other?
This is super important. Sorry if and I completely agree with that. I think there's a disconnect also from politics and businesses.
Yes.
And you were mentioning EVs. We've seen a lot of collaboration in the EV space in Europe of Chinese firms with European companies.
Yes.
We're seeing similar things in the US very quietly, because
Yes.
the businesses understand they need the Chinese technology. So the businesses are trying to circumvent export controls and sanctions themselves, because businesses understand they need each other to deliver those products. We're not decoupled yet. And businesses will probably not want to decouple, because frankly, it doesn't make business sense. So I think there's two different dynamics that are going to play out as well.
Interesting. Interesting food for thought also, of course, for the ongoing conversations. Thank you. Let's move on with the next question from the audience. How can public funding unlock private savings? And how can we go beyond? How can public funding unlock private savings when Europe is not sleepy?
Well,
On your thoughts, but please come in, Jami. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, that's a hard one, because
Yeah.
well, no, why don't you go? It's but it depends on
I don't have a
who
good
the person is and what the private savings is for. If it's a
Exactly.
pension fund and it's widows and orphans, then we need to take a very prudent risk profile. If it's money you don't need, and you might want to go to the casino and you want to invest it, that's a different story. It's really depending on private money and where it's coming from. It's a hard question to address without knowing what type of capital you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it doesn't say it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can just give a very small example from what there's a system in the UK for people to invest into their pensions, where basically you get funding from the government on a monthly basis, and you can only invest that into stocks and shares. And the idea is that that money gets reinvested, but and I think this is a good idea, but it's a very small scale thing. Clearly, there needs to be a lot more incentives, especially in Germany, on encouraging, more investment into the markets to see those investments grow.
I have a follow-up question to that, and maybe we can then find more clarity. How can we mobilize more pension funds and institutional capital in Europe that is often managed by US asset managers to go into European tech investments? Have you an answer to that? I mean, we are now deep diving into into the how-to. So how can we mobilize more pension funds and institutional capital in Europe that's often managed by US asset managers to go into European tech investments? Anna.
Investments will go where the opportunities is, right? Ultimately, I think that if we have firms that are worthwhile to be invested in because they're big enough, then the investment will come. I think the key issue is to build up those firms into a certain size so they become investable. Yeah.
The only other thing I would say to that is, in certain countries, I mean, we can pick the Nordic region, for example, in Europe, some of those governments will prescribe from a legislative point of view, and you find this in the Benelux as well, certain asset allocation parameters. Sometimes they will include venture growth, venture health, venture tech. Sometimes they will preclude it based on, but it gets to your earlier point about politicians who may not have investing acumen or people not wanting to take any political risk with the performance. Because remember, pension funds ultimately, you have to pay 99.9% of someone's livelihood. And therefore, they have to be able to produce a certain return. And that's a very important nuance here, and it's a very sensitive political, and the word, I don't like the word political, it's a very sensitive fiduciary point.
Yeah.
You're a fiduciary and you've got to behave like a fiduciary. Most people don't know what that word means anymore. It means it's responsible investing to make sure you're accomplishing the objectives of the assets.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on for another question when it comes to EU Global Gateway topic. How can concrete funding for advanced technologies enter the new EU budget, and how can the EU Global Gateway evolve to be more attractive compared to China and the USA? How can concrete funding for advanced technologies enter the new EU budget, and how can the EU Global Gateway evolve to be more attractive compared to China and the United States of America?
So can you repeat the first part of the question?
How can concrete funding for advanced technologies enter into the new EU budget?
Well, you need to make the political case for it.
And with the Draghi report of 800 billion, I mean,
yes.
Is this a yes or maybe, or we still need to find the funding?
I think the funding still needs to be found. I think that there is an understanding that the money is not there yet. There is, as I mentioned earlier, the Draghi report is asking for currently, realistic sums that are needed, but politically are difficult to realize. Unless there is the political will to go down that road, which, as I said earlier, may come, but we're not there yet. It depends what happens geopolitically and politically. And I think in the high-tech space, in order to enter into the EU budgeting process, etc., it needs to be made a political priority. I think that actually when you look at what the European Commission is doing in the field of AI, and they understand this is a key priority, I think it's becoming more realistic, right? So, but that is ultimately what needs to happen. It needs to be a priority, there needs to be money allocated to it.
Can I just add, I think it needs to be simpler. I think it needs to be, and the Draghi report, I know in the UK they're thinking about this, but simplifying the regulatory environment around, risk-taking, investing, how governments can, work with the private sector, just simplifying and making it worth the effort to try and go down those roads. Because right now I think a lot of investors say too hard.
Too hard? Too much bureaucracy? Or what do the investors say, John? What do you hear?
Well, I mean, let's take a step back. This is also about role models. You've got a lot of role models right now in the United States. You've got role models in China, people that have been very successful. Okay, name a few role models on innovation and technology in the 21st century in Europe.
That's a hard one.
Well, no, but it makes a point. And so areas need to attract young talent and innovation, people that want to sort of, part of this is, it's not just about the regulation, simplicity, those are good points. Being easier to issue patents, those are good points. But you also have to create a different culture where innovation is part of the society, which on one hand relates to capital and investment, on the other hand also relates to job creation, which your people are very focused on. Politicians are more interested in investing in innovation if they can link it to job creation and impact in an economy. I mean, there are some interesting projects. I know in the Extremadura, I have a Spanish passport. In the Extremadura now, there are a number of new manufacturing sites set up for industrial diamonds and chips. And the Extremadura is the poorest part of Spain, but its capital is going in. There's public-private partnerships. Jobs are being created, and the Spanish government is being very visionary about that.
My mother is from Extremadura. And I have a lot of friends who are campaigning against those mines being put up there. But no, I think you're right in that field. It's just a little anecdote. I think the interesting story here is 2022. What happened in 2022? Because when you look at the productivity growth in the US, and when you look at what happened in Europe, the chart goes into two different directions. And it's not only the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, because actually what happened was we had COVID, and you saw the same fiscal response from left and right-leaning governments, which was helicopter money everywhere, was the same fiscal response. Why did that lead in the US to a productivity increase, and in Europe to a reduction in productivity?
That's a perfect cliffhanger. Why?
Well, I don't know the full answer, but one hypothesis is that in the US, people were given money and lost their jobs and were reallocated to other sectors in the economy. Versus in Europe, many people kept their jobs and kept in the same sectors of the economy. And so there was no reallocation to more productive sectors. That is one interpretation. The other interpretation is that there's something wrong with the US data, but that I don't know. So I think this is a question we need to look at, because how did we go into such different directions when we had the same policies?
And when we had the same crises in a way as
Yes.
well. So that tells a lot about how crisis prepared is the European Union, or how we are still facing with crisis.
I mean, energy clearly played a big role too,
Yeah.
right? But we have countries like Spain, like you mentioned, in Italy, that have been doing much better. And we're clearly the US is much more independent from a lot of energy supplies, food, etc.
Coming to that, to be crisis prepared, before we start the last round of questions here, I heard you've been recently in a podcast called Mission Money, when it all comes to money, and you said it will be difficult for Europe, but Europe can also work against Trump's disruptive outlines, working against fragmentation, working against disruptiveness. What did you mean by that?
Well, what are a lot of countries, not just Europe, going to do when they're faced with a lot more trade disruptions? I think they're trying to circumvent it and create new trade relationships. We've seen this with the agreement to get Mercosur finally signed, which was on the table for a very long time, politically unpalpable at that point. So we're likely going to see more cross-country collaboration, cross-regional collaboration in response to a lot of the trade tariffs that we're going to see. Because the response from Europe, at least, is going to be to try and get free trade from somewhere else. So that's what I meant.
Okay, last question from the audience. Would moving towards the United States of Europe and shifting decision-making away from nation-states be a game changer towards more efficiency? Would moving towards the United States of Europe and shifting decision-making away from nation-states be a game changer towards more efficiency? Jami, can I smile at you and you give me the answer to that very difficult question?
I'm not sure the Americans should answer that question. It seems a little presumptuous.
Okay.
I do think that, there are things that get simplified. if you have, single point, if you have scale, but, look at the defense industry in Europe. It's obviously driven by sovereign issues regarding individual companies and geographic regions, makes it very difficult to scale. So one of the questions about defense spending in Europe moving forward is going to be not just what percentage of your GDP are you spending, but what are you spending it on? And is that the right thing to be spending it on given future of warfare? And is it scalable? So, how many tanks do you want to have in different configurations? How much interoperability do you want to have? I don't know that you have to change the political system of Europe to the United States of Europe, but I think those kinds of questions about scale are going to be very important moving forward.
Wonderful. Last comments on that, or?
Yeah,
I saw you nodding. So.
I agree with what Jami just said. I think there are some baby steps towards that. And those baby steps are already pretty difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
But clearly, I mean, if you have one government to decide, then it's much easier, like you see in the US or in China, versus when you have 27 governments. However, we also have to see that it's in the US's interest to have Europe in this kind of limbo between being the US has no interest in having another real big competitor like we had during the Second World War with one dominant country, either Germany or Italy. They have an interest in Europe being strong enough but also weak enough, and keeping it in this current system is just a sweet spot. So bigger political integration is currently domestically not on the cards, but that's why the focus needs to be on scalability.
John.
Yeah, I think also this comes to having, when you look at global innovation, global capital, you look at Europe, as I said, there isn't a lot of role models, but there has to be a sole voice about the priority and the commitment and the conviction with respect to innovation. So I would put it, you've got a very impressive Ursula von der Leyen as President of the European Union, very impressive, very intelligent, very well-spoken, who seems to always have to spend more time managing the agreements or disagreements among the 27 countries, and perhaps could devote more time to being a bit on a roadshow from a Wall Street point of view about why innovation is a top priority for the European Union. She's impressive, and she's very capable, given her medical background, to handle all these issues.
Thank you so much to the three of you, and of course to your questions. This is the nature of these times. We will not find the answer for a question, right? There are so many different answers in the air, but this is really what brings, or what makes the magic of this pavilion, and also what also brings you here to come here and to join the debate, to come together and to debate on these difficult questions. So thank you very much. I mean, it's also a little bit difficult to be the last panel in front of the lunch. Right, just us before the lunch will be served. So, but give the audience, the panelists, please a big round of applause to Jami, MISCIK, Anna Rosenberg, and John STUDZINSKI.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we have 60 minutes of